They were never meant to be found. Buried in a cave sealed by death and silence, the Dead Sea Scrolls sat untouched for nearly 2,000 years. We thought we knew what they said. We thought they confirmed the Bible. We were wrong. Because now, artificial intelligence has cracked the code, not just reading the scrolls, but revealing what human eyes missed for decades: hidden messages, altered commandments, entire books that don't exist in any Bible you've ever seen. And the worst part? Some of it was never supposed to survive. This isn't just archaeology. This is a digital resurrection of a lost war, not over land, but over truth itself. And what AI uncovered could change everything we thought we knew about scripture, history, and belief. If you're ready to follow this trail to the edge of history, to see what was hidden, deleted, and deliberately buried, hit that like button, subscribe for more deep dive revelations, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. Because the scrolls are talking again, and what they're saying is worse than we thought. It began with ropes, dust, and silence. In 2021, a small team of archaeologists lowered themselves down a sheer cliff in the Judean desert, not knowing if they'd come back with relics or with nothing at all. They weren't treasure hunters. This wasn't about gold or statues. It was about secrets. A place long avoided, even by the brave, the Cave of Horror. Perched high on a cliffside, this cave isn't named for drama. It earned its title the hard way. In the 1960s, nearly 40 human skeletons were found inside, packed into tight corners, limbs tangled as if they had died mid-flight. Jewish rebels, hiding from Rome, caught in the final days of the Bar Kokhba revolt. Families, not fighters. Their story was written in bone and ash, and for decades that's all we thought there was. But the cave wasn't finished talking. Beneath layers of untouched debris, buried under centuries of wind-blown sand and silence, something impossible survived: fragments of parchment. They weren't neatly stored, no jars, no shelves, just scraps, thin as leaves, scattered and nearly invisible. Some the size of a fingernail, others just flecks of text clinging to crumbling fibers. At first glance, it looked like a fluke. But then, letters, ink, words, ancient Greek, not Hebrew, not Aramaic. But through the Greek, one name kept piercing through like a spark in the dark. YHWH, the divine name, written not in translation, but in Paleo-Hebrew. An intentional contrast, like someone wanted to hide something in plain sight. This wasn't just scripture, it was signal fire. AI scanners moved in, ultraviolet, infrared, hyperspectral. What the eye missed, the machines saw: faint ink resurrected, hidden lines, corrections. Entire phrases thought lost to time snapped back into view. But what emerged wasn't just translation, it was transformation. The texts weren't identical to the Bible we know, not even close. Phrases from Zechariah and Nahum appeared, but twisted. Mirrored syntax, altered sequences. The structure looked familiar, but off, as if rewritten for a purpose. The more the fragments were assembled, the clearer it became. These scrolls weren't preserved for ritual. They were rebuilt under duress, rewritten in the dark. And there was something else. Symbols that didn't belong. Uncatalogued marks, possibly ciphers, perhaps messages encoded between the lines. Linguists were puzzled. Were these code words passed between rebel factions? Secret prayers buried beneath the language of empire? One thing was certain. These weren't ceremonial scrolls prepared by temple scribes. They were fast, raw, and portable, wrapped in cloth, folded, not rolled, tucked into rock crevices as if the person holding them knew they didn't have much time. And the cave made sure you felt that time had run out. Every corner spoke of a siege, fire marks on the ceiling, ash deposits in the dirt, pottery shattered mid-use, bones untouched since the day they fell. Some scholars believe the scrolls were written right there, inside the cave, as death crept closer. Not in peace, but in panic. AI picked up more than just words. It picked up hand pressure, tremors in the strokes. One scroll showed jagged lines, uneven ink flow, and slanted script, a signature not of identity but of desperation, possibly an old man, or someone starving or writing under threat. And the passage? The Lord will not leave the guilty unpunished. A judgment, a warning, or just the last line someone ever wrote? Meanwhile, fragments from Nahum cracked open new questions. The mountains quake, the hills melt. But these weren't copied word for word from known manuscripts. Entire verses were restructured, almost like propaganda remixed for those still resisting, like theology weaponized. And it wasn't random. The divine name was preserved in Paleo-Hebrew, not once, not twice, but again and again, always in sacred ink, like an act of defiance inside a translation that served the empire's tongue. This wasn't religion in retreat. It was belief under siege. What's more, the scrolls suggested that those hiding here weren't copying scripture for future generations. They weren't archiving, they were arming themselves with meaning, with warnings, with coded hope in a world collapsing around them. These fragments were more than faith. They were the remains of a psychological fortress, built as the physical one crumbled. The words they carried weren't for the world, they were for God, or for the last people still listening. And the scrolls weren't the only things buried here. Just beyond one of the alcoves, archaeologists uncovered something even older. Not from the Roman era, not from the time of scripture at all. It was a basket, woven, intact, sealed with a lid. Over 10,000 years old, a relic from the Neolithic age, before writing, before cities, before the wheel. Preserved in the same air, the same silence. A Stone Age container resting beside Iron Age scripture. That basket changed everything. It meant this cave wasn't just a place of rebellion, it was a refuge across millennia. A sanctuary that people returned to again and again, not just when they wanted to hide, but when they had no other choice. From prehistoric survivors to rebel scribes, the same truth echoed. This place, this cliff, this narrow slit in the rock was where people went when the world outside had nothing left to offer. And the only thing they could leave behind was their story. But those stories weren't all told in the same tongue. In fact, one of the most jarring discoveries came not from what was buried, but from what was written. The deeper the scans went, the stranger it got. The fragments weren't in Hebrew, not Aramaic either. They were written in Greek. At first, this seemed like an accident. A coincidence? A one-off translation, maybe? But as more pieces surfaced, it became undeniable. The scrolls had been written in the language of their enemies, the tongue of philosophers, imperial decrees, and Roman bureaucracy. And yet in the middle of these fluent, flowing Greek lines, one word kept showing up, out of place, out of time, the Tetragrammaton, the divine name, not translated, not adapted. Written in ancient Paleo-Hebrew, carefully preserved like a fossilized heartbeat pulsing through a foreign body. It wasn't just a sacred word, it was a statement. A refusal to let go of identity, even while surrounded by cultural collapse. What looked like linguistic confusion was actually precision. This was spiritual code switching. Jewish scribes, forced to operate under imperial eyes, embedding their tradition inside the very language meant to erase it, like a tattoo beneath war paint. The scrolls weren't just bilingual, they were bicultural armor. Linguists quickly realized this wasn't about translation. This was negotiation. The choice to write sacred texts in Greek while preserving God's name in Hebrew was an act of theological resistance, a balancing act between survival and memory, between public language and private faith. And it didn't stop at the vocabulary. The scrolls didn't just carry the names of the prophets, they rearranged them, rephrased them, rewrote them. Zechariah, Nahum. You think you know what they said. But here, buried under centuries of silence, their voices came through warped, not broken but transformed. The syntax wasn't ancient, it was surgical. Mirrored phrasing, rhythmic structures, a poetic framework that didn't match any known version from Qumran, the Septuagint, or the Masoretic text. It was something else, something rewritten, not just for clarity, but for a new audience, a dying audience. In one version of Nahum, the famous line, "The mountains quake before him and the hills melt away," was bracketed with an extra stanza, a prediction of betrayal from within. That line doesn't exist in any canon. It appears here, scrawled quickly, almost like an add-on, a warning to those hiding from more than just Romans. Maybe from their own. The edits weren't random. They followed a pattern. The emotional tone changed. Where the original verses were grand and divine, these versions were intimate, panicked, desperate. Less about prophecy, more about pain. They weren't trying to preserve the law. They were trying to process the collapse happening around them. It wasn't theology, it was therapy, written in code. Scroll after scroll bore signs of improvisation, notations in the margins, rewritten lines scratched above the original text. At least 2 different scribes worked on the same passage, one neat and practiced, the other rushed, messy, uneven. It was a scriptural patch job done in hiding, not for a synagogue, for survival. And just when it felt like the fragments had told us all they could, something emerged from the cave that didn't belong to this story at all. It wasn't a scroll, it wasn't even from the same millennium. It was a basket. Hidden behind a boulder deep inside a narrow cavity, woven with astonishing care, sealed tight and entirely intact, over 10,000 years old, perfectly preserved, not flattened, not broken, still standing, like it had been placed there, yesterday. No writing, no markings, just ancient silence wrapped in ancient straw. Radiocarbon testing placed its origin in the Neolithic period, nearly 8,000 years before the Dead Sea Scrolls were ever conceived. This was before pottery, before metal, before history as we know it. A time when humans had just begun to settle, farm, and weave purpose into survival. And here it was, sealed and silent, in the same cave that would later echo with the cries of rebel children and whisper the names of prophets rewritten by hands on the run. The implications hit like a landslide. This wasn't just a cave of scripture. It was a layered time capsule, a generational hideout used and reused by those with nowhere else to go. A place where entire centuries folded in on themselves like pages in a book, from Neolithic wanderers to war-torn zealots, all hiding in the same stone ribs of the earth. And now, modern machines were peeling those pages back. As excavators dug deeper, they realized the basket wasn't buried alone. Surrounding it were remnants of tools, dried grains, bone fragments from animals long extinct, all of it untouched, all of it sealed by time and temperature, preserved not by magic but by neglect. And yet, it fit. The cave wasn't a backdrop, it was a participant. It remembered. It held the echoes of every footstep, every gasp, every whispered prayer sent into stone when the world outside went quiet. The basket wasn't just an object, it was a clue. Evidence that this place had always been more than a shelter. It was a pattern, a recursive loop of collapse and sanctuary, of people returning again and again to the one place that promised nothing, except silence. From the rebels of Rome to the farmers of the Stone Age, it seemed every generation knew the same truth. When civilization turns its back on you, the cave opens its arms. It doesn't care about your language, your gods, or your politics. It only asks one thing. Can you carry your story far enough to survive? The basket, the parchment, the ink, they weren't artifacts. They were signals, flashes from different timelines, all screaming the same message. This is where people came to outlast the end. And somewhere in the shadows of that cave, buried deeper than dust, more signals were still waiting to be uncovered. But not all of them could wait. They had the fragments, they had the parchment. But what they didn't have was time. The scrolls were falling apart, brittle, faded, unreadable. Every second exposed to light was another letter lost. Traditional methods couldn't keep up. The ink was too faint, the language too broken. Human eyes weren't enough. So the archaeologists turned to something ancient scribes could have never imagined. AI entered the tomb. Using multispectral imaging, ultraviolet, infrared, and visible light, researchers scanned every torn scrap in ultra-high resolution. Under normal light, the ink was gone. But under deep scans, ghost letters rose from the surface like smoke from a dying fire. Next, machine learning took over. They trained algorithms on thousands of known Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic manuscripts, teaching the system to read the ancient dead. The AI didn't just translate, it reconstructed. It found partial characters, compared them to stylistic databases, and rebuilt the missing pieces like digital archaeology. At first, it was about recovering text, but soon it became something much bigger. As fragment after fragment was restored, the AI began spotting patterns. Identical brushstrokes in different caves, unusual spacing that reappeared 20 miles away, the same script curvature, same ink viscosity, same parchment prep. These weren't one-off miracles. They were mass-produced. What emerged was not the voice of a lone prophet in the desert, but the blueprint of an entire scribal network, organized and standardized. Not just spiritual, industrial. These scrolls weren't random relics. They were coordinated, a system, a supply chain of belief, but the ones found in the Cave of Horror, they didn't fit the pattern. They were rough, hasty, folded, jammed into cracks, wrapped in linen, stained with time and fingerprints. No ornate jars, no ritual storage. These weren't meant to be found. They were meant to be carried. Families fleeing slaughter didn't have time to curate. They took what they could, scraps of scripture, shreds of meaning, bundled and hidden in the one place the empire feared to follow. These fragments weren't preserved, they were abandoned, left behind in haste, fear, and fading hope. Not for the future, but for the divine. Unlike the scrolls at Qumran, methodically buried in ceramic vessels for long-term storage, these were last rites in paper form, a spiritual defibrillator, not for public reading, but private pleading. You can almost hear it, the soft scratch of a reed pen on parchment, written by torchlight, breath held between lines. And the AI. It heard it too. As the models reconstructed character after character, they began to notice something no scholar could see. Not in language, but in pressure. Some letters were crooked, others too thin. Ink pooled where it shouldn't. The scrolls had been written under stress, and in some cases, physical duress. One scribe, identified only by his odd letter spacing and inconsistent loop sizes, left behind a telltale clue. Tremor lines, micro-vibrations in his strokes, like his hands were shaking. From age, from cold, or from fear. It wasn't random, it repeated. Across multiple letters, across multiple scrolls. The AI flagged it as anomalous. But to paleographers, it meant something deeply human. This was someone writing while in hiding, not in a scriptorium, but in a cave. Maybe starving, maybe hunted. Still writing, still believing. One passage stood out. The Lord will not leave the guilty unpunished. Not copied neatly, scrawled, leaning forward, tilted like the writer was pressed against stone, rushing before someone, or something, found him. It's not just scripture anymore, it's a diary. A voice collapsing under the weight of its own extinction. Not speaking to generations in the future, just whispering into the silence of stone, in case someone, anyone, ever hears. The AI could map linguistic families, detect handwriting, and reconstruct sentences lost to decay. But what it really uncovered was something no machine was built to understand: grief. Each tremble of ink, each lopsided character, wasn't a stylistic quirk. It was a pulse, a sign that the scrolls weren't relics of religion, they were records of resistance, handwritten proof that faith was never about dogma, it was about defiance. The scrolls are full of commands, prophecies, laws, but read closely and you'll see something deeper. Beneath the ink, behind the code, there are people, not saints, not scribes, just desperate souls caught between fire and silence, scratching scripture into paper like a match in the dark. And as the AI kept decoding, it began to map not just what was written, but who had written it. A scribal fingerprint, not biometric, but behavioral. The loop of a lamed, the tilt of a yod, the angle of every alpha. Slowly, it built a database of anonymous authors, hidden hands behind holy words. And one thing became chillingly clear. These scribes weren't just copying scripture, they were changing it. And deeper in the cave of horror, more fragments waited. Fragments that didn't match anything in the known biblical tradition. Passages that spoke of missing books, forgotten laws, and rewritten commandments. The scrolls were becoming something else entirely, not just testaments of belief, but battlegrounds of truth. And the worst hadn't yet been uncovered, because these weren't just fragments, they were clues. As AI dug deeper into the digital scrolls, the texts stopped behaving like isolated discoveries and started looking like pieces of a network in hiding. The evidence was everywhere. Scrolls written in different hands, different dialects, and even different materials. Goatskin here, papyrus there. Some were carefully corrected with side notes and annotations, while others bore signs of panic. Scratched out lines, mismatched segments, hasty ink repairs. These weren't casual inconsistencies, they were survival markers. The more AI analyzed ink compositions and stitching styles, the clearer the map became. The scrolls didn't all come from Qumran. Some shared traits with scribal practices from Jerusalem. Others traced linguistic roots back to Galilean communities. Suddenly the cave wasn't a library. It was one node in a resistance web stretching across collapsing Judea. Not a cult, not a sect, a network. Jewish communities, decentralized, scattered, underground, working in parallel to preserve their beliefs as the Roman world burned everything around them. While the empire erased memory with fire and sword, these people copied it by hand. The scrolls weren't sacred souvenirs. They were the last firewall against oblivion. And then, the silence cracked wide open. The scrolls were supposed to echo familiar scripture. The Psalms, Isaiah, Genesis. But entire books were missing. No Esther, no Chronicles, no genealogies of priests and kings. Gone. And that wasn't all. The Greek translations, once thought to mirror the Septuagint, included characters never mentioned in modern Bibles, events with no reference point, names that shouldn't exist. At first, scholars assumed it was error, bad copying, corruption in transmission, but then a pattern. The omissions weren't sloppy, they were targeted, and the additions weren't random, they were thematic. Chronicles? Gone, because it reinforced priestly legitimacy. Esther? Omitted, possibly for its lack of direct reference to God. Genealogies? Stripped, maybe because they no longer served the story. In their place were scrolls that emphasized communal rituals, not centralized temples. Laws that centered on ethical action, not blood sacrifice. Prophecies that spoke of internal change, not cosmic war. Someone had been editing, and it wasn't just one scribe in one cave, it was a movement, not rewriting scripture by accident, but reshaping it on purpose. What AI found next shook the entire framework of biblical studies. Not just missing texts, not just foreign names, but a fractured theology hidden in plain sight. One scroll opened with a creation story, but it didn't resemble Genesis. It spoke of celestial conflict, of rival divine powers locked in struggle, the earth emerging from their clash, not their will. It wasn't monotheism, it was dualism, a battle of light and dark etched in ink 2,000 years ago. Another fragment rephrased the 10 Commandments, not dictations from God, but agreements among elders. Human voices, not divine thunder. Even God's name, the Tetragrammaton, wasn't consistent. In some fragments, it appeared in Paleo-Hebrew. In others, it was absent entirely. And some scrolls used cryptic symbols in its place, as if invoking the divine was suddenly dangerous or forbidden. This wasn't translation. This was transformation. The scrolls weren't reflecting a settled belief system. They were recording an ideological civil war where factions clashed over what it meant to follow God, to survive empire, to rewrite destiny. Scripture, it turned out, was never settled. It evolved, not in the quiet of monasteries, but in the chaos of caves, through hands covered in dust and blood. It was built under siege, debated in whispers, edited under threat of extinction. These weren't just scrolls, they were weapons of memory, of faith, of identity. And now, after 2,000 years of silence, their voices are speaking again. With the help of artificial intelligence, we're seeing Scripture not as a monolith, but as a battlefield. Not a preserved truth, but an evolving mirror of what people needed to believe. In fear, in hope, in resistance. The Bible, as we know it, may be the final chapter. But these scrolls, they are the missing pages. The question now isn't whether we can handle what was found, it's whether we're ready to face what was left out. Because if this is what survived, what else was erased, what else is still buried? If this opened your mind, hit the like button, share it with someone who still thinks Scripture hasn't changed, and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what we uncover next.